At 2 a.m., Mason Reed slipped into Meridian Trust and executed the impossible $800 million. Vanishing from the banking giant's vaults, flowing directly to thousands of families crushed by predatory loans. His only message: a note on the CEO's desk: "You took their homes, I'm giving them back." How did an ordinary engineer become America's most wanted vigilante overnight? Like and subscribe to uncover the moment that pushed a brilliant mind to risk everything, and share when you've witnessed someone stand against injustice in ways that changed everything. 6 months earlier, Mason Reed sat at his desk in the gleaming Meridian Trust headquarters, his fingers frozen over his keyboard. The numbers on his screen couldn't be right. He ran the analysis again, and the same pattern emerged. The bank's new lending algorithm was specifically targeting vulnerable homeowners, the elderly, single parents, and families in historically marginalized communities. Find anything interesting? Blake Thompson, Mason's supervisor, appeared behind him. Mason minimized the window, just running some diagnostics. Later that night, Mason couldn't sleep. As a senior software engineer, he had access to Meridian's entire digital infrastructure. What he'd discovered wasn't just unethical; it was predatory and likely illegal. The next morning, he drafted a careful email to the compliance department. 3 days later, he was called into a meeting with HR. "Your concerns have been noted," said the stiff-faced HR director, "but our lending practices are fully compliant with all regulations." 2 weeks later, Mason was reassigned to a different project. He tried again, scheduling a meeting with the chief technology officer. The CTO listened patiently, then smiled. "Mason, you're brilliant with code, but you don't understand banking. These people agreed to these terms. We're simply enforcing contracts." That evening, Mason watched the local news. An elderly couple, the Williamsons, were being evicted from their home of 43 years. The reporter explained how their fixed income couldn't keep up with the suddenly ballooning payments on their refinanced mortgage. Mason recognized the pattern immediately. The Williamsons had been targeted by Meridian's algorithm. That night, Mason made a decision. His first call was to Leela Kahani, a cybersecurity expert he'd worked with years ago. "I need your help with something unconventional." "How unconventional?" she asked. "The kind that requires complete deniability." Next was Marcus Chen, a former bank auditor who'd left the industry after becoming disillusioned. "I need someone who understands how money moves," Mason told him. The final member was Riley Jackson, a paralegal at a consumer advocacy law firm. "We need to identify legitimate victims," Mason explained. "People who were deliberately set up to fail. For 3 months, they worked in secret." Mason created a secure digital infrastructure that would leave no trace. Lila mapped Meridian's security systems. Marcus developed a method to transfer funds that would be difficult to reverse. Riley built a database of victims, meticulously documenting each case. They rented a small warehouse space using a shell company and set up their command center. Maps of Meridian's headquarters covered one wall, security patrol schedules on another. Computer simulations ran constantly, testing every variable. "Even if we pull this off," Marcus said one night, "they'll come after us with everything they have." "Not if we give them bigger problems," Mason replied. "We're not just taking the money, we're exposing them." Riley looked up from her stack of case files. "I've verified over 3,000 victims so far. The pattern is undeniable." They created a test system, using dummy accounts to ensure the transfers would work flawlessly. They timed every step of the plan, accounting for security patrols and system backups. As the plan took shape, Mason became obsessed with details. He lost weight, barely slept. The faces of the victims, people like the Williamsons, drove him forward. 1 week before execution, Layla voiced what they were all thinking. "We're crossing a line here. There's no going back." "The line was already crossed," Mason replied. "Not by us, by them. They've been stealing from people for years. We're just balancing the scales." The night before, they gathered one last time to review everything. "Once we start, we have exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes before the system flags the transfers," Mason said. "And then?" Marcus asked. "And then we disappear," Mason replied. "All of us. New identities, new lives." Riley raised her glass. "To justice." They touched glasses, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Tomorrow night," Mason said, "we become modern-day Robin Hoods." As they left, Mason remained behind, staring at the wall of victims' stories. Among them was a newspaper clipping about the Williamsons. They had lost everything. Mr. Williamson had suffered a heart attack shortly after the eviction. Mason touched the paper gently. "This is for you," he whispered. The plan was set. In 24 hours, they would strike at the heart of Meridian Trust and change thousands of lives forever. The maintenance van pulled into the service entrance of Meridian Trust at precisely 1:53 a.m. Mason adjusted his uniform, checking his reflection in the rearview mirror. The magnetic badge clipped to his chest pocket was a perfect replica, down to the holographic security seal. "Comes check," he said quietly. Online, came Leela's voice through his earpiece. She was parked 3 blocks away in a mobile command center disguised as a utility truck. "Systems ready," Marcus confirmed from their warehouse headquarters. Victim database standing by, Riley added. Mason took a deep breath and stepped out of the van. He walked confidently toward the service entrance, toolbox in hand. The night guard barely looked up from his phone as Mason approached. HVAC emergency call, Mason said, sliding his badge. Server room's overheating. The guard glanced at the badge. Didn't get a notification about that. Just came in. Those servers go down. Someone's getting fired. Mason shrugged. Not gonna be me. The guard nodded and buzzed him through. First, hurdle cleared. Mason navigated the empty corridors with practiced precision. They had studied the building's layout for weeks, using blueprints Riley had borrowed from the city planning office. Security patrol on the 5th floor, Leela informed him. She had hacked into the building's camera system and was tracking all movement. Mason ducked into a supply closet as an armed guard walked past. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. Clear, Layla said. The server room required another badge swipe and a 6-digit code. Mason attached a small device to the keypad Layla's creation. It cycled through combinations. In seconds, we're in, Mason whispered as the door clicked open. The server room hummed with the sound of cooling fans and processing power. Rows of blinking lights stretched before him. Somewhere in these machines lay the evidence of Meridian's crimes, and the means to right those wrongs. Mason connected his laptop to the main terminal, initiating Phase 1. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his mind fully focused. Years of working for Meridian had given him intimate knowledge of their systems. He navigated through the security protocols he had helped design, using backdoors only he knew existed. Patrol coming your way, Leela warned suddenly. ETA 30 seconds. Mason ducked behind a server rack. The door opened, and a guard shined his flashlight around the room. Thought I heard something? The guard muttered into his radio. Probably just the cooling system, came the reply. Those things make all kinds of noises. The guard lingered for what felt like an eternity before finally leaving. That was close. Riley breathed over the coms. Mason returned to his work. I'm in the main financial system, accessing the transfer protocols now. For the next hour, he methodically dismantled Meridian's security measures. Each firewall, each encryption layer fell before him, not because they were poorly designed, but because he had designed many of them himself. Starting the verification process, Mason announced he initiated the program they had created, a system that would cross-reference Meridian's internal records with Riley's database of victims. The first batch of beneficiaries is confirmed, Riley reported. 812 accounts ready for transfers. Initiating transfers now, Mason said. First wave, $150 million. On his screen, he watched as the money began to move, not in one massive transfer that would trigger immediate alarms, but in thousands of smaller transactions, each disguised as routine banking operations. First wave complete, Marcus confirmed. Moving to wave 2. As the night progressed, the tension in Mason's shoulders began to ease. Everything was working as planned. The money was flowing to its rightful owners, people who had been systematically cheated by the bank's predatory practices. Final wave. Initiating, Mason announced 3 hours later. $200 million. While the transfers processed, Mason inserted a second flash drive into the terminal. This one contained all the evidence they had gathered, internal memos, the predatory algorithm's code, emails between executives discussing how to target vulnerable homeowners. Everything uploaded to multiple secure servers around the world, scheduled for automatic release to journalists, regulators, and law enforcement. Transfers complete, Marcus confirmed. $817 million successfully redirected. Mason allowed himself a small smile. Initiating system, reset and trace removal. He carefully erased all evidence of his presence in the system, replacing it with a false trail that would lead investigators to believe the hack had originated from the executive floor. As a final touch, he printed a single sheet of paper from his portable printer. On it was a simple message. You took their homes, I'm giving them back. He left it on the keyboard of the CEO's computer, where it would be found in the morning. Time to go, Leela urged. You've got 4 minutes before the next patrol. Mason packed up his equipment and slipped out of the server room. He walked unhurriedly through the corridors. Just another maintenance worker finishing a late-night job. The night guard nodded as Mason exited. Fix the problem. All taken care of, Mason replied with a smile. Systems running perfectly now. He climbed into the van and drove away from Meridian Trust for the last time. By the time the sun rose over the city, Mason Reed would no longer exist and thousands of lives would be forever changed. It's done, he said quietly to his team. We did it. In apartments and houses across the country, thousands of people would soon wake to discover their financial nightmares had ended. Justice, of a sort, had been served. CEO Richard Kensington's face turned an alarming shade of purple as he stared at the note on his desk. Around him, Meridian Trust's executive floor had descended into chaos. 800 million, he bellowed. How is that even possible? The chief security officer stammered. The system shows the transfers were authorized. Using executive credentials yours, sir. Kensington slammed his fist on the desk. I was in the Hamptons all weekend. Find out who did this. In the adjacent conference room, emergency meetings cycled through different departments. IT security specialists hunched over laptops, legal teams huddled in corners whispering urgently, and PR executives drafted crisis statements. The transfers went to thousands of individual accounts, explained the chief financial officer. We're working to freeze them, but it's like trying to catch raindrops. Outside, news vans were already gathering. The story had leaked a Robin Hood-style heist targeting one of the nation's largest banks. We need to control the narrative, insisted Patricia Sharma, head of public relations. This was a sophisticated cyber attack by criminals. Full stop. Meanwhile, in a nondescript apartment 30 miles away, Mason's team was enacting the final phase of their plan: disappearance. The FBI has been called in, Leela reported, monitoring police channels. They're establishing a command center at Meridian headquarters. Mason nodded, methodically destroying equipment. Hard drives were being wiped, then physically destroyed, documents shredded, then burned. Riley, how's the distribution looking? He asked. She looked up from her laptop. The evidence packets have gone to 17 journalists, for regulatory agencies, and the offices of 3 state attorneys general. First stories should break by this afternoon. Marcus entered carrying 4 packages. New identities, passports, driver's licenses, credit cards, backgrounds that will hold up to scrutiny. He distributed them. We need to be on our separate ways within the hour. They had planned for this moment for months, yet now that it had arrived, a heavy silence fell over the room. We knew this was one way, Mason said quietly. New lives, no contact. Riley looked at the others. Was it worth it? Before anyone could answer, Leela's monitoring system pinged. First official statement from Meridian. They're calling it a malicious cyber attack and promising to recover all funds. Mason smiled thinly. They'll try, but we built those transfers to be nearly irreversible. By the time they untangle everything, the money will have done its work. At FBI headquarters, Special Agent Sarah Larson was being briefed on her new assignment. This isn't just theft, her supervisor explained. The precision of the attack, the targeting of a financial institution, and the scale make it a matter of national security. Larson reviewed the preliminary report. Any suspects? None yet. But whoever did this had insider knowledge. Start with current and former employees with the technical skills to pull this off. Back at Meridian, Richard Kensington was facing another crisis. News alerts were pinging on executives' phones. Evidence of predatory lending practices at Meridian Trust surfaces. The bank's legal counsel looked up from his phone, face ashen. Someone leaked internal documents, emails, algorithm specifications, meeting minutes, everything that shows we deliberately targeted at-risk homeowners. Kensington's face went from purple to white. Damage control. Now, by evening, the story had evolved beyond a simple bank heist. Reporters were digging into Meridian's lending practices, finding patterns of foreclosures in vulnerable communities. Former customers were coming forward with stories of suddenly increased interest rates and impossible payment terms. On social media, the hashtag #MeridianJustice was trending. Many celebrated the anonymous hackers as heroes. In their war room, at FBI headquarters, Agent Larson pinned another photo to the investigation board. Mason Reed, she announced. Senior software engineer at Meridian, reported concerns about lending practices multiple times. Suddenly took vacation days that coincide with our theft, and now he's missing. Her partner nodded. He's our guy. Not alone, Larson replied. This required a team. Find his associates, his contacts, someone who knows banking operations, someone with cybersecurity expertise. As night fell, 4 individuals boarded separate flights from 4 different airports, each leaving behind the life they had known. Mason, now traveling as Daniel Fletcher, gazed out the airplane window at the city lights below. His phone a new one. Untraceable buzzed with a news alert. Victims of predatory lending wake to find mortgages paid. He allowed himself a small smile before powering down the device and closing his eyes. The plan had worked. The money was where it belonged. The evidence was public. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The FBI would be hunting them. Meridian would be fighting to recover its reputation and its funds. But tonight, for the first time in months, Mason slept peacefully. Back at Meridian Trust, the lights burned through the night as executives and lawyers tried desperately to contain the damn it. But the truth, like the money, had already escaped their grasp. Eleanor Williams, 76, sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen in disbelief. The email from her bank showed a payment to her mortgage account of $237,842.16, the exact amount remaining on her loan. This has to be a mistake, she whispered, reaching for her phone with trembling hands. After 20 minutes on hold, a customer service representative confirmed. Yes, Mrs. Williams, your mortgage has been paid in full. The payment cleared yesterday morning. But who would Eleanor began? Ma'am, thousands of accounts received similar payments. It appears to be connected to the Meridian Trust incident in the news. I'm afraid I can't provide more details as it's under investigation. Eleanor hung up and looked around her small home where she had raised 3 children, where her husband had taken his last breath, and where she had been fighting to stay since refinancing with Meridian 2 years ago. The payments had suddenly doubled 6 months after signing, despite promises that her rate was fixed. She had been 2 weeks away from eviction. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. "Harold," she said to her late husband's photo, "we get to stay." Across town, Miguel and Sofia Castillo were putting their children to bed when Miguel's phone buzzed. He ignored it until the 3rd notification. "Sofia," he called softly, "come look at this." Their student loans over $160,000 combined had been paid in full. The crushing debt that had forced them to refinance their modest home with Meridian, leading to near bankruptcy when the payments skyrocketed, was gone. "Is this real?" Sofia asked, clutching his arm. Miguel refreshed the screen repeatedly. "It says the payment is processed. Completed." Their 7-year-old daughter appeared in the doorway. "Why are you crying, Mommy?" Sofia wiped her tears. "Because sometimes miracles happen, Mia." In Detroit, Pastor James Thompson stared at the bank statement for Hope Community Center. The mortgage that had been threatening to close the neighborhood haven $425 was now showing a 0 balance. The center had been the heart of the community for decades, offering after-school programs, meals for seniors, and a food pantry. When their original lender was acquired by Meridian, the terms had changed, making payments impossible for the nonprofit. Pastor Thompson had been planning to announce the center's closure that Sunday. Instead, he called an emergency meeting of the board. "God works in mysterious ways," he told them, his voice breaking, "and sometimes, apparently, through hackers." In a cramped apartment in Queens, Diane Chen sat with her 3 children, reading the email for the 5th time. "Mom, what does it mean?" asked her oldest, Jason. "It means we can go home," she said softly. "Our real home." After her husband's death, Diane had struggled to maintain their mortgage payments. Meridian's refinancing offer had seemed like salvation. The hidden terms kicked in, forcing them to downsize to this tiny apartment. "The house is ours again?" Jason asked, eyes wide. Diane nodded, still unable to believe it herself. "Completely paid for." Similar scenes played out across the country. As thousands discovered their financial burdens had mysteriously vanished overnight, news channels began running stories featuring these victims of Meridian, beneficiaries of the hack. As one headline put it, Sarah Reynolds, a single mother of twins, described how Meridian had foreclosed on her home while she was undergoing cancer treatment. Despite her qualifying for hardship deferment, "I lost everything," she told a reporter, wiping away tears. "And then yesterday, I received enough to put a down payment on a new home. My children will have stability again." Veterans, elderly couples, single parents, small business owners, the stories continued to emerge, each with a similar pattern. Vulnerable individuals targeted by predatory lending, now given a second chance. Some recipients donated portions of their windfall to charity. Others used it to help neighbors facing similar struggles. Community funds were established, medical bills paid, children's education accounts funded. A high school in Baltimore that was about to lose its building announced that an anonymous donor had purchased the property and gifted it to the school. "We don't know who to thank," the principal told reporters. "But this school has served this community for generations, and now it will continue to do so." Financial experts appeared on news programs, explaining the mechanics of predatory lending, and how Meridian's algorithms had specifically targeted vulnerable populations. "What we're seeing is the human impact of these practices," explained one consumer advocate. "Each of these stories represents a family that was deliberately set up to fail for corporate profit." Public sentiment began to shift. What had initially been reported as a simple theft was being reframed as an act of economic justice. Meridian's stock plummeted as investors fled. Class action lawsuits were being organized. Regulatory agencies announced investigations. In her small kitchen, Eleanor Williams placed a vase of fresh flowers before her husband's photo. "I think angels come in all forms, Harold," she said, "even as hackers." She opened her laptop and for the first time, searched the term Meridian Trust hack. She wanted to understand who had saved her home, and why. As she read about the emerging evidence of Meridian's predatory practices, her gratitude transformed into something deeper, a sense that justice, rare and precious, had actually been served. Richard Kensington straightened his tie as the makeup artist gave him a final dusting of powder. The CEO of Meridian Trust was about to go live on national television, his first public appearance since the hack. "We're on in 30 seconds. The producer announced. Kensington nodded, his face a mask of practiced concern. The PR team had spent hours preparing him for this interview, crafting the perfect blend of outrage and reassurance. "Welcome back to Financial Morning," said the host. "We're joined by Richard Kensington, CEO of Meridian Trust, which has been at the center of what some are calling the most significant financial crime of the decade. Mr. Kensington, thank you for joining us." "Thank you for having me, Caroline," he replied smoothly. Let me be clear, Meridian Trust was the victim of a sophisticated cyber attack by a criminal organization. This was theft, plain and simple. Some are calling the perpetrators modern-day Robin Hoods, the host countered. Kensington's smile tightened. Robin Hood is a fairy tale. In reality, this criminal act has destabilized a financial institution that serves millions of hardworking Americans. We're working around the clock to recover these stolen funds and return stability to our operations. What about the allegations of predatory lending practices that have emerged? Completely unfounded, Kensington dismissed with a wave. Banking? It is complex, and terms that seem predatory to the layperson are standard industry practices. The documents being circulated have been taken out of context or fabricated entirely. Back at Meridian headquarters, a different scene was unfolding. In the executive conference room, a team of lawyers presented their strategy to a group of visibly stressed executives. "We've filed emergency court orders to freeze the transferred funds," explained the lead attorney. "But we're facing challenges. The transfers were structured in a way that makes them difficult to reverse without the account holder's consent." "So get their consent," snapped the chief operating officer. "It's not that simple," the lawyer replied. "Public sentiment is ... not in our favor. Many recipients are refusing to cooperate, and those with smaller amounts have already withdrawn or spent the funds." The CFO rubbed his temples. "What about the internal investigation? Do we know who did this?" The head of security cleared his throat. "We have strong evidence pointing to Mason Reed, a former senior engineer. He had the access and knowledge. We're also investigating several of his associates who may have been involved. Find them," Kensington ordered as he entered the room, fresh from his television appearance, "and find anything we can use to discredit them publicly. These people aren't heroes. They're thieves and terrorists." Meanwhile, Meridian's legal department was issuing cease and desist letters to news organizations reporting on the leaked documents. Their social media team deployed an army of accounts pushing the narrative that the documents were fake and the hack was the work of foreign agents trying to destabilize the American financial system. They hired a crisis management firm that specialized in reputation rehabilitation. Within hours, full-page newspaper ads appeared with Meridian's new slogan, "Standing strong for America's financial future." Inside the bank, a witch hunt was underway. Any employee who had ever worked with Mason Reed was being questioned. Email histories were combed for signs of sympathy or collusion. Several employees were placed on administrative leave based on merely suspicious connections. "We need to make examples," Kensington told his executive team. "Show that disloyalty will not be tolerated." In Washington, Meridian's army of lobbyists was working overtime, meeting with lawmakers and regulators, reminding them of the bank's generous campaign contributions. Their message was consistent. This was a matter of national security, not consumer protection. Senator William Hayes, chairman of the Banking Committee and recipient of substantial Meridian donations, called a press conference. "While I understand the public's fascination with this Robin Hood narrative," he said gravely, "we must remember that cyber theft threatens the very foundation of our financial system. I am calling for enhanced criminal penalties for these types of attacks." But Meridian's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble. Despite their efforts to suppress the leaked documents, independent analysts were verifying their authenticity. Data scientists were confirming that Meridian's algorithm had indeed targeted vulnerable populations. Former employees, emboldened by the revelations, began coming forward with their own stories. A mid-level manager described being pressured to push risky loans in low-income neighborhoods. A loan officer admitted to deliberately concealing terms from elderly applicants. The financial regulatory bodies, initially cautious, were now under public pressure to act. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau announced a formal investigation into Meridian's lending practices. In a particularly damaging blow, a former member of Meridian's product development team released audio recordings of meetings where executives explicitly discussed how to harvest equity from unsophisticated homeowners. Kensington summoned his crisis team. "This is getting out of control," he fumed. "We need something dramatic to change the narrative." Patricia Sharma, the PR director, presented their new strategy. "We announce a voluntary relief program, debt forgiveness for our most vulnerable customers. We frame it as something we were planning before the hack. That would cost billions," the CFO protested. "Less than what we'll lose if our stock keeps falling and these lawsuits gain traction," she countered. As they debated, Kensington's phone buzzed with an alert. The FBI had just announced a major breakthrough in the investigation. They had identified Mason Reed as the primary suspect and released his photo to the public. Kensington allowed himself a thin smile. The hunt was on. Soon, he hoped, the public would see the face of the hero who had attacked their bank. Meridian could begin rebuilding its shattered reputation on the ruins of Mason Reed's life. Special Agent Sarah Larson pinned Mason Reed's photograph to the center of the investigation board. Around it, she had arranged a web of connections, former colleagues, financial transactions, phone records, and travel patterns. "Our primary suspect has effectively vanished," she told her team. "No credit card activity, No phone usage, no social media. He prepared for this. What about the others? Asked her partner, Agent Diaz. We're assuming he didn't work alone. Sarah nodded and pinned 3 more photos to the board. Leela Kahani, cybersecurity expert, worked with Reed at Tex 5 years ago. Marcus Chen, former bank auditor with a history of whistle, and Riley Jackson, paralegal at a consumer advocacy firm that's filed multiple suits against Meridian. All missing? Diaz noted. All missing? Sarah confirmed. All with technical skills that would be useful for this operation, and all with patterns of communication with Reed in the months leading up to the hack. The investigation room buzzed with activity as analysts pored over data, tracking potential leads. The case had become the Bureau's top priority, not just because of the amounts stolen, but because of the sophisticated methods used and the potential implications for national financial security. Sarah stayed late. Long after most of the team had left, something about the case nagged at her. She pulled up the evidence files on her tablet and began reviewing Meridian's internal documents that had been leaked. Alongside the hack. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Portland, Daniel Fletcher was establishing his new life. He'd found work at a small software company, deliberately taking a position far below his skill level to avoid attention. His new apartment was sparsely furnished, containing only essentials. He maintained strict discipline, no contact with his former life, no searches about the hack, no unnecessary interactions that might expose him. But each night, he allowed himself 15 minutes to check the news through anonymous browsers. The story was evolving. While the FBI hunt intensified, public opinion was increasingly turning against Meridian. Congressional hearings had been announced. Class action lawsuits were gaining momentum. Regulatory investigations had expanded. It was working. Better than he'd dared hope. In Seattle, Leela, now Christine Park, was equally cautious. She'd taken a job teaching basic computer skills at a community center, hiding her expertise behind a facade of pleasant mediocrity. Each day was an exercise in restraint. Suppressing her natural brilliance to remain unnoticed, Mason had chosen their new identities carefully, placing them in different regions but in positions where they could rebuild some semblance of a life. They had agreed. No contact, no exceptions. It was the only way to stay safe. Back in her office, Sarah Larson discovered something odd in Meridian's customer data. The victims of their predatory lending weren't random. They fit specific profiles. Elderly homeowners with substantial equity, recent immigrants unfamiliar with American banking, families in neighborhoods undergoing gentrification. Sarah began cross-referencing these patterns with public foreclosure records. The correlation was unmistakable. Meridian had systematically targeted vulnerable populations, offered them seemingly favorable refinancing terms, then activated clauses that made repayment impossible. This isn't just aggressive banking, she murmured to herself. This is fraud. She pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. The case was becoming more complex. Yes, Reed and his team had committed crimes, serious ones, but Meridian's activities appeared potentially criminal as well. The next morning, Sarah requested a meeting with her supervisor, Assistant Director Reynolds. I need to expand the investigation, she said, spreading out her findings. Lending practices show clear patterns of predatory targeting. Reynolds frowned. Agent Larson, you were assigned to catch the perpetrators of the hack, not investigate the victim. Sir, with respect, understanding Meridian's practices is crucial to understanding motive. Reed tried to report these issues internally before taking action. Catching criminals is our job, Reynolds replied firmly. Banking regulation is someone else's. Stay focused on finding Reed and his accomplices. Sarah left the meeting frustrated but undeterred. That evening, she compiled a confidential memo detailing her findings and sent it to contacts at the Financial Crimes Division and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. 3 days later, in a coffee shop in Denver, Mason nearly spilled his drink when he saw the headline, FBI Whistleblower Questions Meridian Trust Investigation. The article didn't name the agent, but described mounting pressure within the Bureau to examine Meridian's practices alongside the hunt for the hackers. Mason paid quickly and left. Heart racing. He couldn't afford to get sloppy now. Sarah Larson was called into Reynolds' office the following morning. Would you care to explain this? He demanded, sliding a newspaper across his desk. I don't know anything about a whistleblower, she replied truthfully. She had been careful not to leak to the press. You're walking a dangerous line, Larson. Meridian has powerful friends. I'm following the evidence, sir. That's my job. Reynolds studied her for a moment. Fine, follow your evidence. But remember your primary mission. Find Reed and his team. Sarah nodded. I intend to find everyone responsible for crimes in this case, sir. That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment to find it had been searched. Nothing was missing, but her files had been moved, her computer accessed. The message was clear. She was being watched. Instead of intimidating her, it only strengthened her resolve. She was getting close to something important, something worth protecting. In Portland, Mason packed an emergency bag and kept it by the door. If he needed to run again, he would be ready. But for now, he would maintain his cover and watch as the story continued to unfold. The hunter and the hunted, both seeking truth, moved through their separate worlds unaware that their paths were destined to cross. The email arrived simultaneously at 200 news organizations worldwide. The subject line was simple: Meridian Trust. The full story. The sender was untraceable. Attached was a comprehensive dossier that journalists would later call the Reed Manifesto. Though it never mentioned Mason by name, the document began with a simple statement: what follows is the truth about how one of America's largest banks deliberately targeted and destroyed the financial lives of thousands of families. This is not just the story of a theft, it is the story of systematic, legalized robbery that happened long before any hacker touched Meridian's systems. CNN was the first major network to break the story. We have received what appears to be a comprehensive explanation of the Meridian Trust hack, the anchor announced. Our team is verifying the contents, but early analysis suggests these documents contain explosive new revelations. The manifesto was meticulously organized. The first section detailed Meridian's algorithm, explaining in clear, non-technical language how it identified potential targets based on factors like age, education level, English proficiency, and recent financial hardships. The second section provided case studies, anonymized but detailed accounts of families who had lost homes, small businesses that had been forced into bankruptcy, and community organizations that had been destroyed. Each case included documentation, loan agreements, correspondence with the bank, and evidence of how terms had suddenly changed. The third section was the most damaging: internal communications between Meridian executives, emails, meeting minutes, and strategy documents revealed their explicit intention to harvest equity from financially unsophisticated borrowers. In one particularly damning exchange, Richard Kensington had written, "These people don't read the fine print. That's not our problem, it's our business model." Within hours, the manifesto had gone viral. News organizations scrambled to verify its contents. Financial analysts pored over the technical details. Legal experts debated the implications. Mason watched it unfold from a public library computer, careful to leave no digital footprint. This had been the final phase of their plan, set to activate automatically 3 weeks after the hack. Riley had insisted on this component, not just taking the money, but exposing the truth. "The evidence speaks for itself," declared a consumer advocate on a panel discussion. This wasn't just aggressive banking, this was a deliberate strategy to defraud vulnerable customers. Meridian's PR team rushed to contain the damage. They issued statements calling the documents fabricated and taken out of context. They threatened legal action against news organizations that published the material, but the verification process was already confirming the document's authenticity. Technical experts identified digital signatures proving the emails were genuine. Former Meridian employees came forward to confirm the practices described. Social media exploded with the hashtag #MeridianTruth. People shared stories of their own experiences with the bank. A crowdsourced effort began to identify other financial institutions with similar practices. In Washington, congressional leaders called for emergency hearings. The Securities and Exchange Commission announced a formal investigation. Meridian's stock plummeted, triggering market circuit breakers. Sarah Larson received the manifesto through official channels. As the FBI scrambled to respond, she immediately recognized patterns from her own investigation. This wasn't just a random data dump, it was a carefully crafted narrative designed to explain and justify the hack. "This changes things," she told her partner. "Reed isn't just covering his tracks, he's making his case to the public." "Still a criminal," Diaz reminded her. "Yes," she acknowledged, "but one with a clear moral purpose. That makes him both more sympathetic and more dangerous." At Meridian headquarters, crisis mode had become the permanent state of operations. The executive floor was in lockdown, as lawyers, PR specialists, and security personnel worked around the clock. Richard Kensington barricaded himself in his office, emerging only for emergency meetings. His face appeared on television screens, increasingly haggard, as he insisted that Meridian was the victim, not the villain. "We categorically deny these false accusations," he told reporters gathered outside the bank's headquarters. "This is a coordinated attack on a vital American financial institution, and we will not be intimidated by criminals and their sympathizers." But even as he spoke, more revelations emerged. Financial journalists discovered that Kensington and other executives had sold significant blocks of Meridian stock in the weeks before the hack, suggesting they might have anticipated trouble. A former risk management officer revealed that she had been fired after questioning the bank's lending practices. Her wrongful termination suit had been settled with a strict non-disclosure agreement, which she was now violating at great personal risk. "I couldn't stay silent any longer," she explained, "not after seeing the harm these practices caused." The manifesto's fourth section was perhaps the most unexpected, a detailed explanation of where the money had gone. It listed categories of recipients: foreclosure victims, predatory loan targets, community organizations harmed by Meridian's practices. It included the methodology used to calculate payments, ensuring transparency about how restitution amounts had been determined. This was not random theft, the document explained. This was calculated restitution. The money was returned to those from whom it had been taken through legal but deeply unethical means. A prominent ethics professor commented, "While we cannot condone breaking the law, what we're seeing here raises profound questions about justice. When legal systems fail to protect the vulnerable, what options remain for those who seek to right these wrongs?" In Portland, Mason closed the library browser and walked out into the rain. The manifesto was doing its work, shifting the conversation from the hack itself to the practices that had prompted it. He had known from the beginning that he might eventually be caught. But now, at least, the world would understand why he had done what he had done. The truth was out there now. Whatever happened next, that much had been accomplished. The unmarked envelope appeared on Sarah Larson's desk with no indication of how it had gotten there. Inside was a single thumb drive and a note. "Not all of us at Meridian are corrupt. Look at the Davidson algorithm modifications." A friend Sarah stared at it, immediately suspicious. It could be a trap, an attempt to implicate her in something improper. But her investigative instincts wouldn't let her ignore it. She took the drive to the FBI's secured digital forensics lab and had it thoroughly scanned before accessing the contents. What she found made her breath catch. Internal communications from Meridian's executive team that hadn't been included in the public manifesto, including direct orders from Kensington to modify the loan algorithm to specifically target certain zip codes. "This crosses the line from unethical to illegal," she told her supervisor. "They were deliberately violating fair lending laws." Reynolds looked uncomfortable. "The director is getting pressure from Treasury to focus solely on the hack. Meridian is claiming national financial stability is at stake. So we ignore banking crimes because the victims are powerful," Sarah challenged. "I'm just telling you the political reality," Reynolds sighed. "Tread carefully." Sarah left the meeting frustrated but even more determined. That evening, she reached out to contacts at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and shared her findings officially this time, through proper channels. 2 days later, Representative Elaine Washington, a former prosecutor who sat on the House Financial Services Committee, called a press conference. "I have received disturbing evidence of potentially criminal activity at Meridian Trust," she announced. "I am calling for a joint congressional investigation into both the hack and the bank's lending practices." In Portland, Mason watched the press conference on a small television in his apartment. He hadn't anticipated this development, powerful officials taking up the cause. Maybe there would be actual accountability. At Meridian headquarters, the emergence of a whistleblower sent shockwaves through the executive ranks. Emergency meetings were called, loyalties were questioned, accusations flew. "Find the leak," Kensington demanded. "I want to know who's undermining us from within." Patricia Sharma, the PR director, looked exhausted. "Richard, we need to consider a different approach. Public opinion has turned against us. Regulators are circling. Maybe it's time to acknowledge some mistakes and show contrition." "Contrition," Kensington exploded. "That's tantamount to admitting criminal liability. The board would have my head. The board might remove you anyway if we don't change course." She replied quietly, "Our stock has lost 40% of its value. Major clients are leaving. We're facing class action lawsuits in 7 states. Before Kensington could respond, his assistant burst in. "Sir, the FBI and officers from the Financial Crimes Task Force are in the lobby with warrants to seize documents and electronic records." The whistleblower's information had accelerated the investigation dramatically. As news of the raid spread, more Meridian employees began coming forward. A senior risk analyst revealed that he had warned about legal exposure from the targeted lending program 2 years earlier, only to be sidelined. A regional manager described pressure to push predatory loans in predominantly minority neighborhoods. Senator James Carter, chairman of the Banking Committee and a longtime recipient of Meridian campaign contributions, found himself in an uncomfortable position during a television interview. "Senator, given your close relationship with Meridian Trust, will you recuse yourself from the upcoming hearings?" the host asked. Carter shifted uncomfortably. "My committee has a responsibility to investigate all aspects of this situation objectively, even though Meridian and its executives have contributed over $2 million to your campaigns." The senator's discomfort was apparent to viewers nationwide. "The American people can trust that I will follow the evidence wherever it leads." Public sentiment continued to shift. A poll showed that 68% of Americans viewed the hackers as somewhat or completely justified in their actions. Despite acknowledging that laws had been broken, consumer advocacy groups organized protests outside Meridian branches. Customers withdrew their deposits in record numbers. Other banks hastily announced reviews of their own lending practices, desperate to avoid similar scrutiny. In her FBI office, Sarah Larson received another unexpected visitor, Treasury Department Special Investigator James Wong. "Agent Larson," he said, closing her door. "I've been following your investigation. My team has been looking into Meridian for months. Money laundering concerns initially, but we kept finding these lending irregularities. Why haven't we coordinated?" she asked. "Political sensitivities," Wong replied with a grimace. Meridian has friends in high places, but that's changing now. I think we should pool our resources. The alliance between FBI and Treasury investigators created a formidable team. With their combined authority, they gained access to Meridian's complete internal records. Not just what had been leaked, what they found exceeded even the claims in the manifesto. The predatory practices had been more systematic, more deliberate, and more damaging than initially understood. The evidence suggested that similar practices might be widespread throughout the banking industry. Meanwhile, the hunt for Mason Reed continued. His face appeared on wanted posters and news programs. A reward was offered for information leading to his capture. The FBI's technical team worked to track the digital breadcrumbs he might have left behind, but something had changed in the investigation. While officially still pursuing Reed and his team as fugitives, many of the agents, including Sarah Larson, had developed a complicated respect for what they had done. He broke the law, Sarah reminded herself daily. Multiple laws. Yet she couldn't deny that Reed's actions had exposed criminal behavior that might otherwise have remained hidden behind wealth and power. In a small diner in Chicago, Riley Jackson, now living as Megan Porter, watched a customer at the counter, reading a newspaper with the headline, "Meridian Whistleblowers Transform Investigation." She smiled slightly as she refilled his coffee. Their plan had accounted for many contingencies, but they hadn't anticipated this groundswell of support from within the system. Itself, people in positions of power, choosing to risk their careers, to expose the truth. Perhaps, she thought, they weren't as alone as they had believed. Perhaps there were more people of conscience inside these institutions than they had dared hope. As she turned away, the television above the counter showed Richard Kensington being escorted from Meridian headquarters by federal agents. His hands, cuffed behind his back, his face ashen with shock. The caption read, "Meridian CEO arrested on fraud charges." Justice, it seemed, sometimes came from unexpected directions. Mason stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the man who stared back. He had lost weight. Dark circles had formed under his eyes. His hair, now dyed a different color and cut short, made him look like a stranger even to himself. For the third night in a row, he'd woken in a cold sweat. The same nightmare replaying, FBI agents breaking down his door, handcuffs biting into his wrists, a lifetime in prison stretching before him. He splashed cold water on his face and checked the time, 3:17 a.m. Sleep wouldn't return tonight. The small Portland apartment felt increasingly like a cell. He'd chosen it, carefully, a nondescript building with minimal security cameras, cash-accepting landlord, multiple exit routes. But after 2 months, the walls were closing in. Every siren made him flinch. Every knock sent his heart racing. This was the cost he hadn't fully anticipated. Not just freedom, but peace of mind. He made coffee and opened his laptop, carefully connecting through multiple proxies before checking the news. The Meridian story continued to develop. Congressional hearings had begun. Regulatory investigations had expanded to other banks with similar practices. Class action lawsuits were progressing through the courts. In many ways, their plan had succeeded beyond expectations. The money had reached its intended recipients. The truth had been exposed. The system was responding. Yet Mason felt hollow. He thought of his parents, who had no idea where he was or if he was safe. His father's heart condition had worsened. According to the obituaries, Mason compulsively checked each day, terrified of finding a familiar name. He thought of his former colleagues, probably questioned by the FBI, their lives disrupted because of their connection to him. He thought of the future he had sacrificed, the career, the relationships, the simple pleasure of living without fear. Had it been worth it? In Seattle, Layla asked herself the same question. Her new identity as Christine Park felt like an ill-fitting suit. The community center where she taught basic computer skills was fulfilling in its way, but it used only a fraction of her abilities. She deliberately dumbed down her expertise, fighting her natural instinct to solve problems elegantly. Each night, she ran security checks on her digital footprint, ensuring no traces connected her to her former life. Each morning, she rehearsed her backstory before leaving her apartment, terrified of inconsistencies that might give her away. The worst part was the isolation. Layla had always been private, but never lonely. Now, she kept everyone at arm's length, afraid that genuine connection might lead to slips. 2 questions she couldn't answer. In a Chicago apartment, Marcus Chu, now living as David Wong, was having a crisis of confidence. The financial news reported that while most of Meridian's victims had benefited from the hack, some had faced unexpected consequences. Sudden windfalls had affected government assistance, eligibility, tax implications were complex. Some recipients faced legal challenges from creditors suddenly aware of their improved financial status. "We should have anticipated this," he muttered to himself. "We should have created a better distribution plan." The doubt aided him. For weeks he had been drafting a letter to the FBI, considering turning himself in. He could provide evidence, testify against Meridian, perhaps negotiate leniency. His finger hovered over the send button. He thought of Mason, Layla, and Riley, how his action would affect them. He deleted the draft once again. In her small diner job, Riley struggled with different demons. She missed her legal work, the feeling that she was making a difference through legitimate channels. The irony wasn't lost on her. They had broken the law to achieve justice when the legal system had failed. Yet she longed for the structure of that same flawed system. Each of them had known there would be no going back. They had discussed it extensively during the planning, but the reality of life as a fugitive was proving harder than any of them had imagined. Mason opened a secure messaging app and stared at the blank screen. They had established emergency contact protocols to be used only in life or death situations. Every instinct for self-preservation told him to maintain the silence. The separation. Yet the weight of isolation crushed down on him. He began typing. Are we still convinced we did the right thing? His finger hovered over the send button. With a sharp breath, he deleted the message and closed the app. Contact was too dangerous. They had agreed. Instead, he opened a document he'd been working on, a detailed explanation of the technical aspects of the hack. If he was ever caught, this would be his testimony. Not a plea for leniency, but a record of exactly what they had done and why. A historical document that might someday help others understand. As dawn broke over Portland, Mason made a decision. He couldn't continue living in this limbo of fear and isolation. Something had to change. He began researching countries without extradition treaties with the United States, places where he might build something resembling a real life. The money he had set aside, his portion of an emergency fund they had created before the hack, would be enough to establish himself somewhere new. It felt like another betrayal of his country, of his principles, of the silent pact he had made with his team, but self-preservation was a powerful instinct. As he closed his laptop, a breaking news alert appeared on his phone. FBI announces major development in Meridian Trust case. Press conference at 2 p.m. Eastern. Mason's heart raced. Had they found one of the team? Was this the beginning of the end? He canceled his flight search and turned on the television, waiting for news that might determine his fate. Realizing, in that moment of suspended breath, that despite all the hardship, he still couldn't bring himself to regret what they had done. Richard Kensington's lawyer adjusted his client's tie moments before the cameras began rolling. Despite being out on bail, awaiting trial for multiple fraud charges, Meridian's CEO had maintained his position, protected by a board still hoping to salvage the bank's reputation. Remember, the lawyer whispered, this is about rebuilding trust and changing the narrative. Kensington nodded grimly and faced the assembled press. Good morning, he began, his voice appropriately subdued. Recent weeks have been challenging for Meridian Trust, our customers, and the entire financial community. While I maintain my innocence of the criminal charges against me, I acknowledge that mistakes were made under my leadership. He paused, allowing the cameras to capture his practiced expression of remorse. Today, I am announcing the Meridian Restoration Initiative. We will be offering significant settlement packages to all customers affected by our previous lending practices. In many cases, these settlements will include complete loan forgiveness. The room erupted with questions. Kensington raised his hands for quiet. Additionally, we are establishing a $3 billion community reinvestment fund to support affordable housing and financial education in the communities we serve. We are committed to becoming part of the solution. Across the country, in 4 different cities, Mason and his team watched the announcement with varying degrees of disbelief. In his Portland apartment, Mason immediately recognized the strategy. It's a trap, he muttered to the empty room. The press conference continued as a reporter asked the question Kensington had been waiting for. Does this initiative have anything to do with the recent hack and fund redistribution? Kensington's expression hardened slightly. While we condemn the criminal actions taken against our institution, we recognize that many of our customers have suffered. This initiative will ensure that help reaches everyone who was affected, not just those who received stolen funds. Then came the hook. We invite anyone who received funds through the illegal transfers to come forward. Not only will you avoid potential legal consequences for receiving stolen property, but you will be eligible for additional support through our initiative. In the FBI's investigation room, Sarah Larson watched the press conference with growing unease. She turned to her partner. They're trying to flush out Reed and his team. They know they can't recover most of the transferred money directly, so they're creating an incentive for recipients to identify themselves. And once they have those names, Diaz added, they'll use them to trace back to the source. Sarah nodded. We need to be there when people start coming forward. This isn't just about catching Reed anymore. We need to make sure Meridian doesn't use this initiative to victimize people again. She immediately requested a meeting with Treasury's investigation team to coordinate their response. Meanwhile, at Meridian's headquarters, a more private meeting was taking place. Kensington sat with his executive team and a group from Black Castle Security, a private intelligence firm known for its aggressive tactics. The public initiative is your cover, explained Black Castle's director, a former intelligence operative. The real operation happens behind the scenes. We've identified potential pressure points that might draw Reed out. He opened a folder containing photographs. Mason Reed's father was hospitalized last week. Heart condition. His former girlfriend works at Seattle General. His college mentor is giving a lecture series next month at MIT. Kensington nodded. Use whatever resources you need. Find him. We've also analyzed the manifesto's language patterns and technical details, the security director continued. We believe we can identify specific behaviors that might lead us to Reed or his associates. Our surveillance network is already deployed, in likely locations. In Chicago, Riley watched the press conference with growing alarm. The mention of additional support for those who came forward triggered her legal instincts. She pulled out a notebook and began analyzing the careful wording of Kensington's statement. Nothing legally binding, no specific promises. Classic misdirection. She thought of the thousands of victims they had helped, many of whom might be tempted by this offer. Some would certainly come forward, creating data points that could potentially be used to track the team's algorithm and, eventually, them. In Seattle, Leela immediately went to work, strengthening her digital defenses. She set up additional alerts for any unusual activity around their former identities or known associates. She created new escape protocols in case they needed to run again. Marcus, in his Chicago apartment, felt a chill of recognition. As a former bank auditor, he understood exactly what Meridian was doing, creating a public relations victory while setting a trap. The settlement packages would undoubtedly come with non-disclosure agreements, effectively silencing victims who had begun speaking out about their experiences. At FBI headquarters, Sarah Larson proposed a counter-strategy. We need to establish our own presence in this process, she told her superiors. Meridian claims this is about making things right, but we have evidence of ongoing obstruction in their legal cases. I don't trust their intentions. After some debate, the Bureau approved a task force to monitor Meridian's initiative and protect whistleblowers and victims who came forward. Black Castle Security moved quickly, establishing surveillance at key locations connected to Mason's past. They deployed facial recognition technology in transportation hubs in 20 major cities. They created a detailed psychological profile to predict his likely behavior and movements. Reed is methodical and detail-oriented. Their lead analyst reported he plans extensively and values control. This means he's likely established specific conditions under which he would risk communication or movement. And those conditions, Kensington asked. A threat to someone he cares about, a major development in the case, or a chance to further his mission in some significant way? Kensington smiled thinly. Then we'll create all three. The next day, newspapers across the country carried full-page advertisements announcing Meridian's initiative, with a dedicated hotline for those who had received funds through the unauthorized transfers. The ads carefully avoided terms like theft or stolen, maintaining the softer narrative Meridian was now cultivating. Television commercials featured families and small business owners praising Meridian's new approach. Social media influencers were paid to share positive stories about the bank's transformation. In Portland, Mason watched it all unfold with growing concern. He recognized sophisticated manipulation when he saw it. Meridian was using the power of their marketing machine to rewrite the narrative and to set a snare. That night, against his better judgment, he activated the emergency communication protocol and sent a heavily encrypted message to his team. Meridian setting trap. Do not contact. Stay dark. Trust nothing. As he hit send, he knew he was taking a risk. Any communication might leave traces, but the warning had to be delivered. What he didn't know was that Black Castle Security had anticipated this exact reaction. Hidden algorithms were already working to trace the origin of any encrypted communications related to keywords in their search parameters. The hunter and the hunted were circling closer. Sarah Larson sat alone in the FBI evidence room well past midnight, surrounded by boxes of documents. Despite the shift to digital records, Meridian still maintained extensive paper files, particularly for their most sensitive operations. The search warrants had yielded thousands of pages that required manual review. Most of her team had gone home hours ago, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. She pulled another folder from the box labeled Executive Committee Confidential. Inside was a meeting agenda from 2 years earlier. A single item caught her attention. Project Harvest Phase to Implementation. She checked the attendee list. Kensington, the CFO, the Chief Risk Officer, and several names she didn't recognize. She dug deeper, searching for other mentions of Project Harvest. In another box, she found a presentation with the same header. The contents made her blood run cold. Project Harvest was Meridian's codename for their predatory lending program, but it went far beyond what the manifesto had revealed. The internal documents described a deliberate strategy to target communities with high home ownership rates, but limited financial literacy. The algorithm Mason had discovered was only one component. The most disturbing slide detailed how Meridian had worked with select real estate investors to purchase foreclosed properties at below-market rates that Meridian had deliberately pushed into foreclosure through their lending practices. It's a complete cycle, Sarah whispered. They created the foreclosures, then profited from them a second time. She pulled out her phone to call her supervisor, then hesitated. These documents implicated not just Meridian executives, but also several prominent real estate developers, two of whom had close ties to senior government officials. Sarah carefully photographed key documents and uploaded them to her secure government account, then continued searching. In another file, she found communications with regulators that suggested Meridian had misrepresented their lending practices during previous investigations. Most damning of all was a legal memo, advising how to structure the program to technically comply with laws while violating their spirit. The memo specifically acknowledged the harm these practices would cause to vulnerable communities, but framed it as acceptable business risk. By morning, Sarah had compiled enough evidence to expand the investigation dramatically. She prepared her report and requested an urgent meeting with the FBI director and representatives from the Justice Department. The meeting was tense. Sarah presented her findings methodically, watching as the implications sank in. This goes beyond banking fraud, she concluded. This is systematic exploitation of vulnerable communities, with potential civil rights violations. The director looked troubled. Agent Larson, do you understand the political sensitivity here? Some of these names carry significant influence. I understand that justice shouldn't depend on who your friends are, she replied evenly. After a long silence, he nodded. Proceed with the investigation. But by the book, everything documented, everything verified. We'll only get one shot at this. As Sarah left the meeting, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Meridian announces first round of settlements. Thousands come forward. The trap was working. People were responding to Meridian's offer, creating data points that could potentially be used to track the original algorithm and, perhaps, lead to Mason and his team. Sarah made a decision. She reached out to Representative Washington, who had been leading the congressional investigation into Meridian. I need your help, Sarah explained, during their secured call. Meridian's settlement program may be endangering people who receive transferred funds. They're being tracked. What do you need from me? The representative asked. A public warning. People need to know they should seek independent legal advice before accepting these settlements. And they need to understand that coming forward might expose them to surveillance. Within hours, Representative Washington held a press conference. While I welcome Meridian's apparent change of heart, she stated firmly, I am concerned about reports that data from the settlement program is being used for purposes beyond customer restitution. I strongly urge anyone considering offered to consult with independent counsel first. In Portland, Mason watched the press conference with interest. The warning was coded but clear. Someone with inside knowledge was trying to counter Meridian's trap. His emergency message to the team had been brief, but he knew they would understand the implications. Stay hidden. Avoid any contact with Meridian. Trust nothing related to the settlement program. Meanwhile, Sarah continued building her case. The evidence she had discovered transformed the investigation from a hunt for hackers to an exposure of corporate criminality that had affected thousands of lives. She worked methodically, interviewing former Meridian employees who had been involved in Project Harvest, documenting the full scope of the scheme. With each interview, the picture became clearer and more disturbing. One former loan officer broke down during questioning. We knew what we were doing to these people, she admitted, but the bonuses were so good, and management kept telling us it was all legal. As the investigation expanded, pressure mounted from various quarters. Sarah received a call from her former supervisor at Treasury, now working in the private sector. You're making powerful enemies. Sarah, he warned. There are some who think you should focus solely on catching Reed and leave the banking practices to the regulators. The crimes are connected, she replied. You can't understand one without the other. Just be careful, he advised before hanging up. That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment to find it had been searched again more thoroughly this time. Her personal laptop was missing. The message was clear, back off. Instead of intimidating her, it strengthened her resolve. The next morning, she moved all her critical files to secure FBI servers and requested protection for key witnesses. The investigation was reaching a critical phase. Sarah had uncovered enough evidence to support criminal charges against multiple Meridian executives, including Kensington, but the case against Mason Reed and his team remained active as well. As she reviewed the files on both investigations, Sarah confronted a troubling question. In a system where legal mechanisms had failed to prevent such exploitation, were Mason's actions truly criminal, or were they the only effective response to a greater injustice? She was sworn to uphold the law, yet the evidence before her revealed how that same law had been twisted to enable widespread harm. For the first time in her career, the clear line between right and wrong began to blur. Sarah closed the file and made a decision. She would follow the evidence wherever it led, even if it forced her to question everything she had believed about justice. The Black Castle security team leader slid a tablet across the table to Richard Kensington. We've got a hit. Kensington studied the grainy surveillance image. The man in the frame had different hair, different glasses, but the facial recognition software had flagged key structural features. Where Portland, downtown library. He's been careful using public computers, varying his schedule, but pattern recognition caught him. He's accessed news about Meridian through anonymizing services 6 times in the past 3 weeks. Kensington's fingers tightened around the tablet. Do we have a current location? Not yet. We're deploying additional resources to the area. It's only a matter of time. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Riley felt the net tightening. Twice in the past week she had noticed the same man at different locations near her apartment. Once reading a newspaper at the coffee shop across the street, later browsing at the bookstore she frequented. She had prepared for this possibility. That evening, she activated her emergency protocol, packed a single bag with essentials, withdrew cash from an account established under her false identity, and left her apartment through the service entrance. As she boarded a bus heading south, she debated whether to warn the others. Communication was dangerous, potentially compromising everyone, but if she had been identified, the others might be at risk too. She decided to wait until she reached her safe location before making contact. In Seattle, Layla noticed unusual activity on her digital monitoring system. Someone was searching through archived records connected to Mason's former colleagues. The queries were sophisticated, masking their origin, but Leela had built better traps. She traced the intrusions to a private security firm, Black Castle Security. She immediately hardened her digital defenses and began preparing for potential physical surveillance. Years in cybersecurity had taught her to recognize the signs of a coordinated hunt. In Portland, Mason remained unaware that he had been identified. He continued his careful routine, working at the small software company, keeping to himself, minimizing his digital footprint, but a persistent feeling of unease had settled over him. His emergency message to the team had gone unanswered. Had they received it? Were they safe? The isolation that had been their protection now felt like a way to know if the others were in danger. At FBI headquarters, Sarah Larson received a troubling report. Marcus Chen had been detained at O'Hare International Airport, attempting to board a flight to Venezuela using a false passport. He broke under pressure. Her partner explained, was trying to flee the country. Sarah hurried to the detention center, where Marcus was being held. His face was haggard, his eyes downcast as she entered the interview room. Marcus Chen, she began formally. I'm Special Agent Sarah Larson, FBI. I need to ask you some questions about the Meridian Trust hack. Marcus looked up, resignation in his expression. I'll tell you everything, but I want a deal. That depends on what you have to offer, Sarah replied, and whether you're willing to give up Mason Reed and the others. Marcus hesitated. They're good people. They did what they thought was right. So did you, Sarah acknowledged. But now you need to think about yourself. Cooperation will be considered during sentencing. Over the next 3 hours, Marcus detailed his role in the operation, how he had helped structure the transfers to ensure they reached the intended recipients, how he had identified victims of Meridian's predatory practices. He confirmed what Sarah already suspected: the hack had been meticulously planned as an act of justice, not simple theft. What he didn't provide were the current locations or identities of his teammates. I don't know, he insisted. We established a communication blackout after the operation. Clean break, no contact. Sarah wasn't certain she believed him, but his cooperation provided valuable insights into the technical aspects of the case. As she left the detention center, her phone rang. It was her supervisor. Black Castle Security has filed for cooperation with our investigation, he informed her. They claim to have located Reed in Portland. Sarah felt a surge of conflicting emotions. The case was coming to a head. I'll fly out first thing tomorrow. There's more, her supervisor continued. They've requested permission to make the arrest themselves, citing their private contract with Meridian. That's completely inappropriate, Sarah objected. This is a federal investigation. Politics, he sighed. Meridian still has friends in high places. They're pushing for Black Castle to take the lead, with FBI in support role only. Sir, given what we now know about Meridian's practices, allowing their private security to handle this raises serious ethical questions. I agree, that's why I'm sending you. Keep them in check, make sure everything's by the book. In Portland, the net continued to tighten. Black Castle operatives established surveillance on Mason's apartment building. They tracked his movements to and from work. They monitored the public computers he had used. Unaware of the danger, Mason stopped at a grocery store on his way home from work. As he selected an apple, a news alert appeared on his phone. Meridian accomplice arrested at Chicago airport. His blood ran cold. Marcus, it had to be. The carefully constructed operation was beginning to unravel. Mason abandoned his shopping and walked quickly toward his apartment, mind racing. He needed to run immediately. The emergency bag was packed, the escape route planned. All he needed was to reach his apartment, grab his essentials, and disappear. As he rounded the corner to his street, instinct made him pause. Something felt wrong. He stopped, pretending to check his phone, while surveying the area. A van parked across from his building, 2 men sitting in a car half a block away. Someone new at the newspaper stand who seemed too interested in the passing pedestrians. They had found him. Mason turned and walked calmly in the opposite direction, fighting the urge to run. His secondary escape plan involved a bus station 3 blocks away. If he could reach it without being spotted, he might still have a chance. As he walked, he removed his glasses and jacket, changing his silhouette. At the next corner, he ducked into a coffee shop, exited through the back, and continued moving away from his compromised apartment. The bus station came into view. Freedom was just yards away. Mason quickened his pace slightly. "Mr. Reed," the voice came from directly behind him. Mason froze, then slowly turned to face a woman holding up an FBI badge. "Special Agent Sarah Larson," she said. "We need to talk." Mason's mind calculated escape routes, but his body remained frozen. Agent Larson stood between him and the bus station, her badge still raised. "Black Castle Security has this area surrounded," she said quietly. "They're working for Meridian, and they're not interested in due process. I suggest you come with me instead." Mason studied her face, searching for deception. "Why would an FBI agent help me?" "I'm not helping you. I'm ensuring proper procedure." She glanced over her shoulder. "We have about 2 minutes before they realize I've found you. Your choice." Something in her direct gaze convinced him. Mason nodded once. Sarah led him to an unmarked car parked nearby. "Stay down," she instructed, as they pulled away from the curb. Through the window, Mason glimpsed men in dark clothing converging on the spot where he had been standing. "They'll know you have me," he said. Eventually, Sarah agreed, but not immediately. "I disabled the GPS on this vehicle and left my phone behind. Standard protocol would have me take you directly to the Portland field office for processing, but that's not where we're going, not yet." Sarah navigated through side streets, checking the rearview mirror frequently. "I have questions that need answers before you enter the system." She drove to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the kind of location that made Mason's instincts scream trap. But when they entered, the space was empty except for a small table and 2 chairs. 20 minutes, Sarah said, checking her watch. "That's all I can give you before I have to report your apprehension." Mason sat cautiously. "What do you want to know?" "I've seen the evidence against Meridian," she began. "Project Harvest. The deliberate targeting of vulnerable communities, the coordination with real estate investors to profit from foreclosures." Mason's expression darkened. "Then you understand why we did what we did." "I understand your motivation. What I need to know is, how deep does this go? Is Meridian unique, or is this systemic throughout the banking industry?" The question surprised him. This wasn't standard interrogation procedure. "It's not just Meridian," Mason replied carefully. "We focused on them because I had insider access, but I've seen similar patterns at other institutions. The technical implementation varies, but the predatory intent is consistent." Sarah nodded, as if confirming a suspicion. "What about political protection?" "The investigation keeps hitting roadblocks: pressure from Treasury, resistance from regulatory agencies." "Follow the money," Mason advised. "Campaign contributions, speaking fees, revolving door between banks and regulatory positions." Meridian didn't just buy politicians. They bought the system. Sarah checked her watch again. "I'm building a case that goes beyond the hack itself, one that exposes the entire corrupt infrastructure. But I need more than what we've found so far." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to be arrested today no matter what. The question is whether you get taken in by Black Castle, where who knows what happens to you, or by me. With full constitutional protections." Mason considered her words. "And in exchange for these protections, information, testimony, help navigating the technical aspects of Meridian's systems that we haven't been able to crack." She leaned forward. "Your manifesto exposed part of the truth. I want to expose all of it, even if it implicates powerful people, especially then." Sarah's expression hardened. "Justice shouldn't depend on wealth or connections." Mason made his decision. "There's a secure server containing everything we didn't include in the public release. Access codes are stored in a safety deposit box under the name Daniel Fletcher at First Community Bank downtown. Key is in my apartment, taped inside the bathroom vent." Sarah nodded and stood. "Time to go." "What happens now?" "Now I arrest you. Officially, you'll be charged with multiple federal crimes. But you'll have proper legal representation and protection from Meridian's private security, and my team." Sarah's expression remained neutral. "Marcus Chen is already in custody. Others are still at large. Leave them out of this," Mason urged. "I'll take full responsibility." "That's not how this works," Sarah replied. "But I give you my word, they'll receive the same protections if they're apprehended. No black sites, no private security contractors, no enhanced interrogation." As they drove toward the FBI field office, Mason stared out the window at the passing city. "Do you think what we did was wrong?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question. "Legally? Yes, unquestionably. Morally?" She paused. "The law isn't always the same as justice. But in a functioning society, we can't have individuals deciding when to ignore the law, no matter how noble their intentions, even when the system is rigged." "Then we fix the system," she replied firmly. From within, the Portland FBI field office buzzed with activity as Sarah escorted Mason through the secure entrance. Agents stopped to stare at the notorious hacker whose face had been on their most wanted list for months. Sarah's supervisor met them in the processing area. "Agent Larson, we've been trying to reach you. How did you find Reed?" Good investigative work, she replied simply. I am formally placing him under arrest on federal charges related to the Meridian Trust case. Black Castle Security is demanding custody, he informed her. They claim jurisdiction under their contract with Meridian. That's not how federal law works, Sarah replied coldly. Reed is accused of federal crimes and will remain in federal custody. As Mason was processed, photographed, fingerprinted, formally charged, Sarah noticed several men in suits observing from the hallway. Not FBI, private security, almost certainly. She approached her supervisor again. I need to speak with the U.S. Attorney immediately regarding protective custody for Reed. There are concerns about witness tampering and external pressure on this case. Already arranged, he assured her. After your findings about Project Harvest, the Attorney General's office is taking a personal interest. Reed will be transferred to a secure federal facility, away from local influences. That evening, Sarah returned to her hotel room and found a message waiting on her secure FBI laptop. It had been routed through multiple layers of encryption, yet somehow had reached her government account. Agent Larson, thank you for keeping your word with Mason. We're watching. If you're sincere about exposing the full truth, check the financial records of Senators Hayes, Feldman, and Congressman Wilson. Follow their family foundations. A friend. The message was unsigned, but Sarah had little doubt it came from one of Mason's team, most likely Layla Kahani. Given the sophisticated delivery method, Sarah considered reporting the contact but decided against it. Sometimes justice required unorthodox alliances. The next morning, she began investigating the financial connections between Meridian and the named politicians. What she found confirmed Mason's claims about systemic corruption, millions funneled through seemingly legitimate foundations, favorable legislation coinciding with major donations, family members appointed to lucrative positions. The web of corruption extended far beyond a single bank. It implicated regulatory officials, politicians from both parties, and some of the country's most powerful financial institutions. Sarah compiled her findings into a confidential report and sent it directly to the Attorney General, bypassing the normal chain of command. She had crossed a line, but the stakes were too high for procedural niceties. Her phone rang almost immediately. It was the Attorney General herself. Agent Larson, we need to talk. What you've uncovered, it's bigger than we thought. How quickly can you be in Washington? The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was surrounded by media vans and protesters carrying signs with slogans like Free Mason Reed and Jail Banker Criminals. The case had captured national attention, evolving from a simple bank heist story into a referendum on financial justice. Inside, security was tight as the most significant hearing in the case was about to begin. Judge Alina Rodriguez, known for her fierce independence and immunity to political pressure, had been assigned to the case effect that made both prosecution and defense nervous for different reasons. Mason entered the courtroom in handcuffs, escorted by federal marshals. 3 months in detention had left him thinner but no less determined. His eyes scanned the packed gallery, noting the mix of journalists, financial industry representatives, and ordinary citizens who had lined up since dawn to secure seats. In the prosecution section sat Assistant U.S. Attorney James Bennett, surrounded by a team of Justice Department lawyers. Their table was loaded with documents and evidence boxes, the accumulated weight of the government's case against Mason Reed. At the defense table sat Carolyn Chen, a public defender who had stunned observers by declining offers of assistance. From high-profile attorneys volunteering to represent Mason pro bono, Mr. Reed has chosen to be represented by the public defender's office, she had told reporters. He believes justice should be equally available to all, regardless of resources. What no one in the courtroom knew was that Chen had been receiving anonymous packages of meticulously prepared legal research and case precedents courtesy of Riley Jackson, whose legal training had found purpose in this shadow assistance. Judge Rodriguez entered, and the room rose. Be seated, she commanded. United States versus Mason Reed. This hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed to trial on all charges. Mr. Bennett, you may begin. The prosecutor approached the podium. Your Honor, the government's case is straightforward. The defendant, Mason Reed, conspired with others to hack into Meridian Trust's systems and redirect nearly $800 million. This constitutes computer fraud, theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence is overwhelming and includes digital forensics, witness testimony, and the defendant's own manifesto explaining his actions. Judge Rodriguez nodded. Ms. Chen, the public defender, rose. Your Honor, we do not dispute that Mr. Reed accessed Meridian's systems or that he participated in redistributing funds. What we dispute is whether these actions constitute crimes in the context in which they occurred. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Mr. Reed's actions were a necessary response to Meridian Trust's systematic criminal exploitation of vulnerable communities, exploitation that regulatory agencies and law enforcement had failed to address despite clear evidence. We intend to present an affirmative defense of necessity. Bennett objected immediately. Your Honor, necessity is not a valid defense for premeditated actions of this magnitude. Reed had legal alternatives. which he pursued, Chen countered. Mr. Reed reported Meridian's predatory practices through proper channels multiple times. He was ignored. When systems of justice fail, citizens must sometimes act directly to prevent greater harm. Judge Rodriguez studied both attorneys. This is a novel application of the necessity defense. Ms. Chen, I'll allow you to present your argument, but you face a high burden of proof. The hearing proceeded with the prosecution presenting its technical evidence, the digital trail connecting Mason to the hack, the complex money transfers, the careful planning that had gone into the operation. Then came the defense's turn. Chen called her first witness, Eleanor Williams, the 76-year-old widow who had nearly lost her home to Meridian's predatory practices. Mrs. Williams, please tell the court about your experience with Meridian Trust, Chen prompted. Eleanor's voice quavered, but grew stronger as she spoke. After my husband died, I struggled with the mortgage. Meridian offered what they called a senior protection refinance. The representative promised lower payments and told me not to worry about the fine print, said it was all standard legal language. She paused, dabbing at her eyes. 6 months later, my payments doubled. When I called, they said it was all in the contract I signed. I was 2 weeks from eviction when the money appeared in my account. Similar testimonies followed a parade of Meridian victims, describing how the bank had deliberately targeted their vulnerabilities, trapped them in impossible financial situations, and then profited from their distress. Chen then called Sarah Larson to the stand, a move that surprised many observers. An FBI agent testifying for the defense was unusual, to say the least. Agent Larson, please describe what you discovered about Meridian's Project Harvest initiative, Chen requested. Sarah outlined the evidence she had uncovered, the internal documents showing deliberate targeting of vulnerable communities, the coordination with real estate investors to profit from foreclosures, the systematic nature of the exploitation, and was this information known to regulatory authorities before Mr. Reed's actions? Chen asked. Elements of it had been reported, Sarah testified, but the full scope was either unknown or ignored until our investigation following the hack. Bennett's cross-examination was aggressive. Agent Larson, regardless of what Meridian may have done, do you believe individuals have the right to take the law into their own hands? Sarah chose her words carefully. I believe in the rule of law, but I also believe that when systems meant to protect the public are corrupted or compromised, we face difficult questions about justice that go beyond simple legal formulations. The courtroom fell silent at this unexpected philosophical turn from a federal agent. As the hearing continued, Chen introduced evidence that had been provided in the anonymous package's internal emails, showing how Meridian had deliberately manipulated regulatory oversight, records of campaign contributions coinciding with favorable legislative actions, proof of how complaints about predatory practices had been systematically buried. Judge Rodriguez listened attentively, occasionally asking pointed questions of both sides. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her reputation for thoroughness. She would leave no aspect of the case unexamined. On the final day of the hearing, Mason himself took the stand. Chen had advised against it, but he had insisted. Mr. Reed, she began, please explain to the court why you felt it necessary to take the actions you did. Mason looked directly at Judge Rodriguez. Your Honor, I exhausted every legal avenue available. I reported Meridian's algorithm to compliance, to executives, to regulatory hotlines. Each time, I was ignored or silenced. Meanwhile, thousands of people were losing their homes, their savings, their futures, all through technically legal but profoundly unjust methods. And you appointed yourself their savior, Bennett interjected during cross-examination. No, Mason replied. I simply used the skills I had to expose what was happening and return what had been taken. I knew there would be consequences for me. I accepted that risk because the alternative, doing nothing while this harm continued, was unacceptable. As the hearing concluded, Judge Rodriguez addressed the courtroom. This case presents unusually complex questions about the intersection of law, justice, and civic responsibility. I will take these arguments under advisement and issue my ruling in 1 week. That week was filled with intense public debate. Legal scholars published opposing views on the necessity defense in this context. Financial industry representatives warned about the dangers of vigilante justice. Civil rights organizations pointed to the case as evidence of systemic failures. In financial regulation, when the court reconvened, the room was completely silent as Judge Rodriguez delivered her ruling. The law exists to protect society and provide just remedies for wrongs. When it fails in that essential purpose, when it becomes a shield for predation rather than a sword for justice, we face a fundamental crisis of legitimacy. She paused. Surveying the courtroom, I find that the defendant has presented sufficient evidence to support a modified necessity defense. While Mr. Reed's actions cannot be fully justified under existing law, neither can they be judged without acknowledging the extraordinary context in which they occurred. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom. Therefore, I am ruling that while this case will proceed to trial on reduced charges, the necessity defense may be presented to the jury. Additionally, I am ordering a parallel investigation into Meridian Trust and associated entities based on the evidence presented in this hearing. Bennett was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, the government objects strenuously to this unprecedented ruling. Your objection is noted, Mr. Bennett, and the government is free to appeal. But in my courtroom, justice requires considering not just the letter of the law, but its purpose and its failures. As Mason was led from the courtroom, a reporter called out, Mr. Reed, do you have any comment on the ruling? Mason paused and looked back. The law should protect people, not profits. If this case helps rebalance that equation, then whatever happens to me will have been worth it. Richard Kensington stood motionless as federal agents entered the Meridian Trust executive floor. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division, bolstered by Judge Rodriguez's ruling, had arrived with search warrants far more extensive than the initial ones. Richard Kensington, announced the lead agent, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, racketeering, and violation of fair lending laws. As Kensington was led away in handcuffs, similar scenes played out across the country. The CFO was arrested at his country club, the chief risk officer at his son's basketball game. Board members received early morning visits from federal agents. The financial press called it the Meridian Sweep, the most aggressive action against a major financial institution in decades. Stock markets wobbled as investors questioned which bank might be next on in Washington. Congressional hearings on banking reform took on new urgency. Senator Hayes, whose financial ties to Meridian had been exposed, recused himself from the proceedings too late to save his reputation. Financial regulators faced harsh questioning about their failure to identify and stop Meridian's practices. The system was designed to look the other way, testified a former regulator. Enforcement was deliberately underfunded. Complaints were rooted to dead ends. The regulatory capture was complete. Meanwhile, Mason's case continued toward trial. The prosecution, stung by Judge Rodriguez's ruling, offered a plea deal, guilty, plea to reduced charges, 5 years in federal prison. Testimony against Meridian executives. Carolyn Chen presented the offer during a private meeting in the detention center. It's a good deal, she advised. The necessity defense is still a long shot at trial. You could be facing 20 years. Mason considered the offer. What about Marcus? And if they capture Leela and Riley? I've pushed for similar terms for all of you. The prosecutor seems amenable. They're more focused on Meridian now. Mason nodded slowly. I'll take the deal on one condition, public testimony. I want to explain exactly what Meridian did and how they did it in open court, on the record. The prosecutor agreed, recognizing the public relations value of Mason's testimony. Against Meridian, the plea hearing was scheduled for the following week. News of the plea deal sparked debate. Some viewed it as too lenient for the largest financial hack in history. Others argued it was too harsh, given Mason's motives and Meridian's far worse crimes. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse was again surrounded by protesters and media. Mason entered his guilty plea to reduced charges of computer fraud and conspiracy. Then, as agreed, he was permitted to make a public statement. What I did was illegal, he began, and I accept the consequences. But I want to be clear about why I took these actions. Meridian Trust deliberately targeted vulnerable communities, the elderly, immigrants, the financially inexperienced. They designed systems to identify these vulnerabilities and exploit them for profit. He detailed the technical aspects of Meridian's predatory algorithm, explaining in clear terms how it worked and how it had been concealed from regulators. This wasn't just Meridian, he continued. The problem is systemic. Banking has become a mechanism for extracting wealth from the vulnerable rather than helping communities build prosperity. Until that changes, true justice will remain elusive. Judge Rodriguez sentenced Mason to 5 years in federal prison, acknowledging both the seriousness of his crimes and the extraordinary circumstances that prompted them. Mr. Reed, while I cannot condone taking the law into your own hands, I recognize that your actions have exposed significant failures in our financial regulatory systems. Perhaps that will be your most important legacy. As Mason was led away, his eyes met Sarah Larson's in the gallery. She gave him a subtle nod, a gesture of respect between adversaries, who had become unlikely allies in pursuit of a larger truth. The same day, in a different courtroom, Richard Kensington and 5 other Meridian executives were arraigned on multiple federal charges. They pleaded not guilty, but their confident demeanors had vanished. The evidence against them was overwhelming, bolstered by cooperating witnesses from within the bank who had decided to save themselves. In the following weeks, Marcus Chen also accepted a plea deal, receiving a 4-year sentence. He provided detailed testimony about how Meridian's victims had been identified and how the redistributed funds had been structured to avoid detection. Leela, Kahani and Riley Jackson remained at large, though the intensity of the manhunt had diminished as focus shifted to the banking executives. Rumors circulated that they had fled the country, though no confirmed sightings had been reported. The recipients of the redistributed funds faced their own challenges. While no effort was made to reclaim the money from individual victims, many faced tax implications and questions about how to legally account for their windfall. Community organizations established free financial counseling services to help navigate these complexities. Eleanor Williams used part of her funds to establish a neighborhood assistance program for elderly homeowners facing foreclosure. Mason Reed may have broken the law, she told a local reporter, but he saved my home and my dignity. I want to pay that forward. The legal proceedings against Meridian Trust continued for months. As investigations deepened, connections to other financial institutions emerged. 2 additional banks announced internal reviews and executive changes. Hoping to avoid Meridian's fate, regulatory reforms gained momentum. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau received expanded authority and funding. Banking oversight committees were restructured to reduce conflicts of interest. Algorithms used in lending decisions became subject to fairness audits and transparency requirements. 6 months after his sentencing, Mason sat in the prison library, reading about these changes with measured satisfaction. The price he was paying. Years of freedom felt steep but necessary. A foundation had been laid for genuine reform. A guard approached with a letter, a rare occurrence. As Mason had few approved correspondence, the return address was unfamiliar, but when he opened it, he immediately recognized Riley's writing style, disguised as a letter from a fictional cousin. "The seeds we planted are growing," she wrote. "Change is happening. Your sacrifice was not in vain. Stay strong. We carry on the work from outside legally now, through advocacy and education. 5 years will pass. Justice is a long game." Mason smiled slightly as he folded the letter. 5 years was indeed a long time, but systemic change was longer, still a generational project. He had played his part, at great personal cost. Now others would carry the work forward, hopefully through legal channels that wouldn't require similar sacrifices that night. As he lay on his bunk, Mason reflected on the question that had haunted him throughout. Had it been worth it? The answer, he decided, wasn't for him to determine. History would judge whether his actions had helped bend the arc of financial justice toward fairness. For now, all he could do was serve his time with dignity and hope that the changes taking root would endure. 1 year after the Meridian Trust case, Sarah Larson stood before a congressional committee. Now, as the newly appointed head of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Task Force, "The reforms implemented thus far are encouraging," she testified, "but our investigation has revealed similar predatory algorithms operating at 7 additional major financial institutions. This isn't about a few bad actors, it's about an industry that prioritized extraction over service." Her promotion had surprised many, given her unorthodox approach to the Meridian case. But her meticulous documentation of the corruption had made her both respected and feared in financial circles. Exactly what the reform-minded administration wanted. Across the country, the ripple effects of the case continued to spread. Banks scrambled to audit their lending practices, afraid of becoming the next Meridian. Compliance departments doubled in size. Algorithm reviews became standard procedure. Customer complaint systems were overhauled. "It's not altruism," noted a banking industry analyst. "It's self-preservation. No one wants to face what Meridian's executives faced." The trial of Richard Kensington and his co-defendants had been the financial spectacle of the year. Unlike Mason, they had refused plea deals, confident in their high-priced legal teams and industry connections. That confidence had evaporated when former colleagues turned state's evidence, providing damning testimony about deliberate targeting of vulnerable communities. Internal communications revealed shocking callousness toward struggling homeowners. "These aren't financial transactions, they're people's lives," the prosecutor had emphasized in closing arguments. Homes where children grew up, retirement security built over decades. Community anchors, all deliberately destroyed for profit. The jury had needed only 6 hours to return guilty verdicts on all counts. Kensington received a 15-year sentence, 3 times longer than Mason's. The others received between 8 and 12 years, depending on their level of involvement. The verdicts had sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms nationwide. Suddenly, legal but unethical no longer seemed like a safe operating principle. Executives in multiple industries initiated ethics reviews, recognizing that public sentiment had shifted. In Chicago, Riley Jackson, still living under her assumed identity but no longer in hiding, had founded the Financial Justice Project, a nonprofit organization helping communities understand predatory financial practices and advocate for themselves. Though she couldn't reveal her connection to the Meridian case, her legal expertise and passion made her an effective advocate. During a community workshop in a church basement, an elderly man approached her. "You remind me of someone," he said, "a young woman who helped us fight our foreclosure years ago." Riley's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "I get that a lot," she replied with a smile. "Just one of those faces, I guess." In Seattle, Leela Kahani had also found a new purpose. Working through anonymous channels, she developed open-source tools that could detect potentially predatory patterns in lending algorithms. Her software was being adopted by consumer advocacy groups nationwide, providing early warnings about harmful financial products. Though still technically fugitives, both women had established new lives dedicated to continuing their mission through legal means. They remained cautious, but were no longer living in constant fear. The intense manhunt had faded as authorities focused on bigger targets in the financial world. Meanwhile, the communities that had benefited from the redistributed funds were transforming. In Detroit, the Saved Community Center had expanded its programs to include financial literacy classes and homebuyer education. In Atlanta, a formerly declining neighborhood had established a community land trust to ensure long-term affordable housing. Eleanor Williams had become something of a local celebrity. Her story featured in a documentary about the Meridian case. She regularly visited schools to talk about financial literacy and the importance of understanding contracts. Read the fine print, she would tell students. And if you don't understand it, find someone who does. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Mason's case had sparked academic debates about civil disobedience in the digital age. Law schools added the case to their ethics curriculum. Computer science programs discussed the responsibilities of technologists when they discover harmful applications of their work. A popular ethics professor at MIT framed the question to her students: if you discover that systems you've helped build are causing widespread harm, and institutional channels for remedy have failed, what is your moral obligation? The answers were never simple. Reflecting the complex ethical territory Mason had navigated. In the financial industry, structural changes continued. Several major banks proactively forgave predatory loans, seeking to avoid Meridian's fate. New transparency requirements forced lenders to explain algorithmic decisions in plain language. Community reinvestment commitments increased dramatically. Senator Maria Gonzalez, who had led the congressional investigation, introduced comprehensive banking reform legislation. The Meridian case exposed not just one bank's misconduct, but a regulatory system designed to fail. She explained, "We're rebuilding that system with ordinary Americans in mind." The legislation faced fierce opposition from financial lobbyists, but had gained surprising bipartisan support. The public, across political lines, had united around the idea that the financial system should serve communities rather than exploit them. In federal prison, Mason followed these developments through newspapers and limited internet access. His case had made him something of a prison celebrity, though he avoided the attention as much as possible, preferring to spend his time tutoring other inmates in math and computer skills. On the anniversary of his sentencing, he received a letter from Judge Rodriguez, an unusual gesture from the bench to a defendant. "Mr. Reed," she wrote, "while I remain convinced that our system cannot condone the methods you chose, I want you to know that your actions have catalyzed important changes. Sometimes it takes a seismic event to reveal fundamental flaws in our institutions. History's judgment of your actions may differ from the court's." Mason folded the letter carefully and placed it with his few personal possessions. The judge's words provided a measure of validation he hadn't realized he needed. That evening, a news report caught his attention. Meridian Trust, its reputation destroyed and its legal liabilities mounting, had been dissolved. Its assets were being acquired by a consortium of community development financial institutions committed to serving underbanked populations. The reporter concluded, "This marks the final chapter in a case that has fundamentally reshaped how Americans think about banking, algorithms, and economic justice." Mason smiled slightly. Not the final chapter, he thought. Just the end of the beginning. The ripples from what they had done would continue long after his sentence was complete, spreading outward in ways they could never have anticipated, changing lives and institutions in their wake. For all the personal cost, that knowledge brought him a measure of peace. 4 years and 7 months into his 5-year sentence, Mason Reed sat across from the parole board. His prison record had been exemplary. He had established a coding education program for inmates, maintained perfect behavioral marks, and provided ongoing assistance to the Financial Crimes Task Force investigating cases similar to Meridian. "Mr. Reed," began the lead examiner, "your case presents unusual circumstances. While your crimes were serious, your cooperation has been significant, and the context of your actions continues to influence ongoing reforms." Mason nodded respectfully. He had prepared extensively for this hearing but had remained realistic about his chances. Early release was possible, but far from guaranteed. "I accept full responsibility for my actions," he stated, "and while I can't say I would have made different choices given the same circumstances, I am committed to pursuing justice through legal channels moving forward." After deliberation, the board granted him early release with specific conditions: 3 months in a halfway house, regular check-ins with a parole officer, restricted internet access, and a prohibition on employment in financial technology without explicit permission. 2 weeks later, Mason walked out of federal prison into the spring sunshine. No media waited. He had requested a private release, wanting to avoid the spotlight that had followed his case. Only one person stood in the parking lot: Sarah Larson. "Agent Larson," he acknowledged with surprise. "I didn't expect a welcoming committee." "It's Director Larson now," she corrected with a small smile, "and this isn't official business. I thought you might need a ride." During the drive to the halfway house they talked about the changes that had occurred during Mason's incarceration. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Task Force that Sarah now led had prosecuted executives at 5 additional banks for practices similar to Meridian's. Congress had passed the most comprehensive banking reform legislation since the 2008 financial crisis. Algorithm transparency laws required lending institutions to explain in plain language how automated decisions were made. Your case changed things, Sarah admitted. Not just the financial system, but how we think about digital ethics and whistleblower protections. And the others? Mason asked cautiously. Layla and Riley? Sarah kept her eyes on the road. Officially, they remain fugitives. Unofficially, the investigation is no longer active. Resources are better used elsewhere. Mason nodded, understanding the unspoken message. At the halfway house, before Sarah departed, she handed him a business card. When your parole conditions allow it, the task force could use consultants with your expertise, legitimate ways to use your skills for reform. I'll consider it, Mason replied. Thank you. The next 3 months passed slowly as Mason adjusted to limited freedom. He reconnected with his parents, who had stood by him despite the public shame. His father's health had stabilized. The stress of his son's incarceration had finally eased. After completing his time at the halfway house, Mason found a small apartment and took a job teaching computer science at a community college work his parole officer had deemed appropriate. The students had no idea about his past. He used his middle name, Joseph, to maintain his privacy. On a crisp fall day, 6 months after his release, Mason received a text message from an unknown number. Coffee. The shop across from the library. 2 p.m. He recognized the carefully neutral phrasing, the kind Riley would use. Despite the risk, he couldn't resist the opportunity to see her again. The coffee shop was busy when he arrived. In the corner, a woman with different hair and glasses looked up from her laptop. Even with the changes, he immediately recognized Riley. Professor Joseph. She greeted him with their prearranged cover. Thanks for meeting to discuss the mentorship program. They spoke carefully at first, discussing fictional students and curriculum while checking for surveillance. Gradually, confidence growing that they weren't being monitored, the conversation shifted. Layla, Mason asked quietly. Safe, Riley assured him, working in cybersecurity for a consumer advocacy group. Different name, different city, but still fighting the good fight. And you? Riley smiled. The Financial Justice Project is expanding to 3 new cities. We're helping communities understand predatory practices and advocate for themselves. Legal methods, but effective ones. No regrets? Mason asked. Riley considered the question. About helping people? Never. About the cost to our lives? Sometimes, but then I meet another family who kept their home because of what we did, and I know it was worth it. They talked for an hour, careful not to remain together too long. Before parting, Riley slid a thumb drive across the table. Data on 3 more banks using similar algorithms, all legally obtained through whistleblower channels. Sarah might find it useful. Mason pocketed the drive, recognizing that the alliance continued, now operating within legal boundaries. 1 year after his release, Mason was invited to speak at a conference on financial ethics and technology. With his parole officer's approval, he accepted. Ready to step back into the public eye for the first time since his trial, the auditorium was packed as he approached the podium. His heart raced as he faced the audience, academics, industry professionals, regulators, and students, all there to hear from the man whose actions had sparked a revolution in financial oversight. 5 years ago, he began, I made a choice that forever altered my life and the lives of many others. I don't stand before you seeking approval or forgiveness for that choice. Instead, I want to talk about the responsibility all of us have when we build systems that affect people's lives. He spoke about the power of algorithms, the danger of optimizing for profit without ethical constraints, and the human cost when technology enables exploitation. He challenged the technologists in the room to consider the real-world impacts of their work, beyond efficiency metrics and profit margins. The question isn't whether artificial intelligence and algorithms will transform finance, he concluded. They already have. The question is whether that transformation will serve humanity or exploit it. That choice belongs to all of us. The applause was thunderous. Afterward, a young software engineer approached him. I work at a major bank, she confided. Last month, I flagged a lending algorithm that showed bias against certain zip codes. 3 years ago, I would have been ignored or fired. Instead, the project was halted for review. That's because of you. Such moments became increasingly common as Mason cautiously re-entered professional circles. Though some still viewed him as a criminal, many more saw him as a catalyst for necessary change. He began consulting with ethical technology initiatives, helping design systems that prioritized fairness and transparency. On the 5th anniversary of the Meridian hack, a comprehensive documentary premiered, featuring interviews with victims, banking experts, regulators, and even Sarah Larson. Mason declined to participate but watched with interest as the film explored the complex legacy of what had happened. The final scene showed Eleanor Williams in her garden, surrounded by neighborhood children. She was teaching about growing vegetables and financial literacy. Before all this happened, she told the interviewer, I was just an old woman about to lose everything. Now I have my home, my dignity, and a purpose helping others. Some call what those young people did a crime. I call it justice. As the credits rolled, Mason turned off his television and stepped onto the balcony of his modest apartment. The city, lights spread before him, each representing homes and lives that continued regardless of market forces or algorithmic decisions. The system wasn't perfect, likely never would be, but it was better than before, more transparent, more accountable, more just. His personal cost had been substantial. 5 years of freedom, a permanent criminal record, career limitations, public notoriety, yet watching the changes unfold, the lives saved, the communities preserved, the predatory practices curtailed, he found himself at peace with the choice he had made. Justice, he had learned, rarely came without sacrifice. Sometimes it required extraordinary courage to expose entrenched wrongs and force accountability. His team had taken that risk, paid that price, and helped bend the arc of financial justice toward fairness. It was enough. If you found this story of courage, justice, and fighting against corruption inspiring, please like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that explore the complexity of modern ethics and justice. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against a broken system? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.